funny how the national anthem for the U.S. is more like a story, like on a dark and stormy night. Mm-hmm. This one's like Canada's like, we love it, eh?
That's funny because I've thought that too about that it is like a story, and didn't we steal the music from like an English one or something?
Probably, but the original national anthem was not the Star Spangled Banner. It was America, America, God shine. That was the original one.
I thought it was that Lee Greenwood song. We're gonna kick you in the ass, America.
There was that's too key.
Hello, and welcome to the Todd and Taylor Show. I'm Todd A.
I'm Taylor Trask.
And
hey,
how's it going? This is
good.
Yeah, in the interest of transparency, we have had many technical issues this week, and so I think it's kind of caught us both by surprise that we're actually rolling. We talked about the topic that we were going to talk about tonight, and I had a very weird intro to it, which has to do with another podcast. So I'll lay that on you, right. Which is I listened to a podcast called "How Did This Get Made," which
How
is.
have I not heard of that? Hang on.
It's amazing. So it's Paul Scheer, Jason Mantzoukas, and Paul's wife June Diane Raphael. They talk about terrible movies.
June Diane Raphael. That sounds like a great name. How did this get made? All right, I'm subscribed.
So it's all about terrible movies, which appeals to me as a former Blockbuster employee who consumed hundreds of these with his 2 free checkouts every night. Mm-hmm. So anyway, they were talking. Well, I listened to a podcast recently. I don't know if it was a recent podcast, but it was about they had watched Lawnmower Man, which I believe is like 91, 92. It stars Pierce Brosnan and Jeff Fahey, and I remember it as Stephen King's Lawnmower Man, which was definitely how it was advertised when it came out on video. But they explained this whole story of how someone had the rights to a Stephen King story called Lawnmower Man, et cetera, et cetera. He sued because the movie had nothing to do with his story. They just wanted to use his name, and he actually won this.
The movie has nothing to do with the Stephen King book.
Right.
Okay.
And
I've always been confused.
It wasn't even a book. It was a 7-page short story.
Oh, wow. Okay.
And so he sued him. He won, but they finally removed the name from the theatrical version. But then when they put it on video cassette, I guess the company claimed the winning lawsuit didn't apply to the video cassette. So it's still printed up everywhere as Stephen King's Lawnmower Man, even though it's a totally made up thing. So I've never seen this movie. I just remember it was on our Blockbuster trailer tapes that we had to watch, all day, every day. So I knew a good bit about, at least I knew the sort of premise of the movie when they were talking about it. And they mentioned this thing. There was one moment in the movie where they're talking about, so the movie has to do with virtual reality and sort of, this is a crazy tangent that I'm going to try and tie into our main topic, but it has to, they talk about how badly this virtual reality and the internet is imagined, and then there's all these parts that we recognize from bad sort of B movies or 80s and 90s sci-fi where science fiction is just kind of explained like, hey, it's science, there's always some character that's like, don't worry about it. And
it's that science kid. I'm a hacker. My favorite was when in Jurassic Park, she at the very end, the little kid wheels the thing up. She's like, this is a Unix system. I know this. I'm a hacker. And she's constantly talking about her hacking abilities. And at no time does she ever hack anything. It's just that I'll just click this and internet stuff, right? Yay.
Yeah, another movie that How Did This Get Made talks about is Hackers. With
oh my God.
Jolie,
oh wow.
Which is that theme, taken to its total climax. But
by the way, real quick before we go on, because I pulled up the Lawnmower cast right away. Guess who's in it that I've seen this movie 2 or 3 times. I had no idea. Breaking Bad's own Dean Norris, freaking Uncle. What was his Breaking Bad name? He was the.
Never watched it.
Oh my God! You've never watched Breaking Bad?
I've tried several times to watch it.
Hank,
I can't get it.
Uncle Hank himself is in Lawnmower Man. That's bizarre to me because he's I only know him from Breaking Bad. So I'm sorry. Just for those at home who are like, I got to go watch Lawnmower Man. Well, pause this, go watch it, find Dean Norris, come back, and we'll continue.
Because the podcast from this point on will have nothing to do with it. But basically it hit me while I was listening to this that in the 80s and 90s, sci-fi was really loose with that. It was basically fantasy, which touches on an episode we did in our season 1 where we talked about sci-fi, and I can't remember if we preceded The Martian with that conversation or it came afterwards, but we did one podcast on The Martian. We did one on sci-fi and talked about hard sci-fi being sort of factual sci-fi that, it was like sci-fi that could happen. Mm-hmm. And so I was thinking about this through the lens of all these superhero movies that we've watched lately. And you and I just done a podcast on Arrival, and it just hit me like what a change there's been in 20 years where fantasy used to be much more accepted. It was sort of like we weren't always picking it apart. I mean, I know that's the joke of How Did This Get Made, is to pick apart sort of the bad logic of movies. But, but really that's just fantasy, it's not hard sci-fi. And so it's kind of unfair sometimes to pick apart fantasy sci-fi as though it's hard sci-fi, as though this is supposed to be like, stuff that could happen.
Yeah.
And obviously they got into a problem because the whole plot is about virtual reality and some kind of internet. And these are things that exist and, were nascent at the time of the movie. So, they were, kind of stating that it was a hard sci-fi movie. Anyway, what we really wanted to talk about were a slew of Marvel movies, both within the MCU and not. And Doctor Strange, I just, that kind of tied in for me because
really?
Doctor Strange approaches fantasy from a kind of hard sci-fi way. This is Doctor Strange learns magic like anyone learns anything, and I think I actually read that in a review. So I'm not trying to steal that idea from someone else, but it was.
Oh no, they say it in the freaking trailer. He's like, how am I going to learn how to get from here to there? And she's like, how did you become a surgeon? He's like, patience and practice.
Yeah.
And,
Yeah, and he's reading books. As soon as he learns to sort of teleport, he's stealing books out of the library. I mean, so we almost got it's not quite hard sci-fi, but it's within that believable. And believable, is that a bad word to use there?
Yeah, I wouldn't call it, but I mean, when you throw Dormammu into the mix, like the believability kind of goes out the window. It's weird that as you're saying this, I'm thinking back to my reaction when I was watching it, and it was a very psychedelic movie, right? And it's like its presentation, but you're right, like so much of it was kind of academic, and almost. I'm not saying it was modeling Harry Potter, because clearly this came in terms of comics before Harry Potter, but there was sort of a wizarding school aspect to it that I kind of liked. And they sort of, I think part of that was just to showcase, he's a top-notch surgeon who's going to become a top-notch, sorcerer. Interesting. I'm going to ponder that a little bit more.
Yeah. So we had talked about Doctor Strange on a live podcast we did, which we will not plug at all. But I figured if we wanted to kind of get into that we can. But specifically, I thought let's cover some of these Marvel movies that I have binged in the last 2 weeks that we didn't really do great service to over the past year.
Okay. Yeah, you're right. We kind of missed we did miss a few, didn't we? Or I saw them and you hadn't seen them, or
Right. And then even like Civil War, we just sort of mentioned it. I remember I know we had like an off-air conversation about, do we need to cover that anymore?
God, Civil War feels like years ago now for me. Jeez, that was May, wasn't it? Holy crap.
Well, and that's probably the easiest one to start with, and it's the one that I watched first on my binge. I rented it when I was recently on a flight across country, and just watched it on the flight. And one of the things we didn't get, I think this was kind of why we didn't get into it at the time. I don't know. Correct me if I'm wrong. I think the action sequences in it are the best of any Avengers movie, like period. Like the
they're
fights
phenomenal.
And stuff are amazing. And the story is kind of garbagey.
Here's the okay, so I'm glad you said that, because I recently, we're not going to talk about it, but I recently watched Suicide Squad, and as I was going through it, I thought to myself, Civil War looks amazing, but you're right. There's a lot of weird, wonky story stuff to the point where it's like, I mean, I would say pound for pound, the story problems in Civil War are the same as Suicide Squad. And people
I can't disagree with you about that. And
people rip on Suicide Squad to no end, or any of these DC dark movies, and they just give every free pass in the world to the MCU. I think part of that is just simply because the MCU has built up so much goodwill at this point over 8 years that it's easy to do that. But yeah, when you start to really dissect Civil War, I mean, so many things, so many plot holes and so many issues. Like the one that comes to mind immediately is where, is it Baron? What's his name? Baron. The little kid from Inglourious Bastards. Baron Zemo, or I think he's just Zemo in this movie. But
sure,
Zemo, he's reading out of the diary, like the trigger words.
Yes.
And I'm like, all Bucky had to do was close his ears. Like, why was he? You know, he was in there. Like he could have screamed out and gone la 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 la. Like he's in there trying
to close his ears.
Yeah. Like plug his ears with his fingers. Like,
well, I believe his hands are strapped down because he actually has to break out of the strap with the mechanical arm.
But yeah. I thought he had done that halfway through, so he still could have like plugged his ears, or he still could have like screamed really loud, or like, you know.
It's it's problematic. I think that scene and many others are, even if they're not, you know, even if you can defend it in the way I just sort of lamely did, like. Yeah, there's still a problem with it. Like that is weird. Well, why didn't he, once he ripped one arm free, you know, stick his finger in his ear?
Let's take it even a step further. Zemo's entire plan, like I love that the actor who plays him is great, but his entire plan is the most convoluted nonsense. Like he's got to kill this guy to get this journal, to then recite these words to free this guy, to get this guy mad at this guy, to then get them back to this base where he's not even going to activate the super soldiers at the base. He's just going to kill them all. Spoilers. To just get these two guys to fight more, to make it's like what? Like when you really list it out, when you like whiteboard it out, it's I wonder where Kevin Feige was during those plot meetings. Like why did they think that was like who's running this show? Like what the hell? And they just kind of, I wonder if they've gotten so machine-like with their workflow now that there isn't sort of a filter for some of that to go through. Like, 'cause if they had done like 2 or 3 more passes at that script, they could have tightened up a lot of that stuff.
Well, that's funny because that doesn't even approach the stuff that I think is problematic. Like,
ooh, okay,
the place where, and see, I think one of the reasons it gets credit is because a lot, you know. I think people, like you said, they've earned a lot of goodwill. The Marvel universe has, but also when it was called Civil War, we sort of knew what it was going to be about because of the first Civil War series that Marvel did, and we knew they were going to take some liberties with it. But when it comes in, so there's a bad accident in, I believe I think they're in Nigeria. When the explosion happens that Scarlet Witch tries to control and ends up still killing
in the
people.
opening sequence.
And so the next, you know, there's a couple scenes later, all the Avengers are gathered around this table, and this U.S. official, you know, government official comes in and drops this huge book on the table and says, it's the Sokovia Accords. No one at that moment explains what the Sokovia Accords are. And the book is like 1.5 inches thick.
You're right. Yeah.
A scene later where like either Falcon or War Machine or whatever his name is, Iron Patriot, or like somebody's reading it a little bit later. But like, you know, Steve doesn't read it. Tony presumably has been briefed on it. Black Widow doesn't read it. Nobody else reads this. Like they all have opinions on it and no one has explained it. And they all just start saying like, what's that mean? They control us, you know? And sure enough, that's what they do. But it's like, guys, 30 seconds of that. Like they, you know, it's such a dramatic, actually what he does before he drops the big book on the table is the government official plays clips of all the destruction that's the Avengers' fault, you know?
Yeah.
And Steve's the one that's like, okay, enough, you know, what's this about? And, but you think like, well, he didn't even have to come in and say that. He could have said, guys, you know, in light of the last accident, we have proposed these accords and just like bullet point it for them, you know, like we're not, and it's kind of like what you said about Suicide Squad. Like if I nitpick stuff like this, I can just sort of hear the voices of people who are like, that's ridiculous. Just don't nitpick that. Like, just roll with it, But it's like, isn't that what people are nitpicking about Lawnmower Man in this episode?
Yeah,
How did this get made? It's like we live in a world where we can understand like fantasy as it ties to reality a little bit better when it's. I know we understand fantasy a little bit better when it is tied to reality or something.
I think. By the way, I love your Steve Rogers impression. I think you got to be, if you're an executive at Warner Brothers, like you got to be like after Civil War comes out and then like you're like, okay, cool, there's some plot holes, but Suicide Squad, we're on the same page, and everybody just shits on Suicide Squad. You've got to be just pulling your hair out, like, come on, like what the hell? To the Marvel fans' credit, I think the big difference is that the DCU is so grim and dark that just that makes everybody miserable going in, and then so they're more apt to nitpick stuff. Whereas if you have a bright shiny Iron Man costume and a bright shiny Captain America costume and everybody's happy and smiling, and freaking Black Panther smiles and puts on, like, everybody gets so caught up in that they don't look at these obvious story flaws. I'll tell you this, I haven't rewatched Civil War since. Like normally I watch these Marvel movies at least 2 or 3 times.
Well, that's the other reason we didn't talk about it.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Well, I've seen like the original Avengers that came out, which also had its flaws, but for the most part was a pretty solid little film. I own that. I watch that, once or twice a year now. So it's like that since then. And I think once Civil War, those Marvel movies in May are kind of like the kickoff to the summer. So they really sort of set the tone for what's to come. And I used to be the biggest, summer movie guy of all time. Like I appreciate film, but summer movies are like an amusement park ride. And I'm like, yeah, here we go. This is the first summer in a long time where I left Civil War going, well, yeah, I guess, I didn't hate it. I didn't love it. I just kind of felt meh about it. And I wonder what that's, what you could tie to that. If it was the plot, if it was just everything, if it was fatigue, I don't know.
Well, it's also a little long.
It is. Yeah, you're right.
And but when you're talking about other movies that we feel like maybe didn't get a fair shake, you and I did talk about Superman versus Batman, which, if you stack it up against Civil War, even if you stack up the theatrical version, like what is the difference? Like, I mean,
yeah.
I got that feeling of like, why are these two heroes fighting each other? But the fight scene at the end of Civil War is more brutal than the Superman Batman one, because these are both mortal people. Yeah. And it's more senseless. Mm-hmm. The Superman Batman's I've also on my binge last weekend. So I know we're not going to touch on this too much because it's not Marvel, but I watched the extended version, which is like 3 fucking hours long.
Jesus.
But so it took me, I just checked in, when I had time to check into this. But now granted, it should have been 2 movies, I think, at that point. It's like if you shoot 3 hours and that's what makes sense, make it 2 movies. But
unless you're Peter Jackson.
Oh God. Yeah. And then make 3 3-hour movies. But it does like instantly they start tying stuff up in the extended cut that's not tied up in the theatrical cut. And so I do wonder if is there some version of Civil War out there that, was there some cut that was much longer where this conflict was explained better? Because like I said, the Sokovia Accords are dropped on this desk. Tony and Steve instantly have positions on it. And from that moment on, they're angry at each other. And I actually like the reveal of Zemo to Black Panther when he explains his plot of like, this is, this is why I did all this to sow this discord and stuff. And I think it sets up the rest of the MCU, like the movies to follow, I think are set up really well because of that.
Yeah.
But it's that all teetering on this really flimsy like plot device in the beginning of these accords that we don't know anything about, Yeah.
To be fair, though, that didn't bug me so much because think about how much legislation in this country is just glanced at and then passed without any, so it's like there's a little, if anything, you could argue that is accurate because like people just, we pass stuff willy-nilly and nobody seems to care.
Well, the thing that's weird that like comes true later is in the Accords. Like one of the things Steve brings up is, what if we think we should go somewhere and they don't want us to? And you're like, how do you even know this concerns a they? I mean, the official, and I believe, I'm not totally sure, but I believe that's, I think it's the general that's always pestering the Hulk. I can't remember his name.
Oh yeah, but, the General Ross.
I believe that's Ross that drops this on him. But he says something about the UN or whatever, but he doesn't explain like they're going to be in charge of you.
Yeah.
And the other thing, that we've brought up on the podcast before, that this is just, it's not in line with. He comes in and he's like, you're a private outfit and you can't do the blah, 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 blah. They're not a fucking private outfit. Like S.H.I.E.L.D. put them together, and S.H.I.E.L.D. is a government agency that worked with Hydra. It's like, get off your fucking high horse, Ross. Like it's just ridiculous. In Winter Soldier, we found out that Tony Stark was actually helping S.H.I.E.L.D. repair the helicarriers. And Winter Soldier is where we find out that Hydra and S.H.I.E.L.D. are the same organization. And then, as we've covered over and over, like, it's all Tony Stark's fault in Avengers and in Ultron. Like, that's his doing. And in Iron Man 1, 2, and 3. Like, he is the cause of all the Avengers' problems. And presumably he's the one that's, like, got them on some kind of payroll to live in his, the Avengers complex or tower or whatever. We assume that's all being paid for by Iron Man, but again, like, give us 1 minute of exposition that explains what's going on in some of those.
That's just it.
Just have Tony Stark say, look, I can't afford, like, we're going to be legally liable or something. I can't afford the whatever. I don't know that. I know that would be stupid, but it's like, just say it. Just
when we talk about affording stuff, the other big sort of thing that I actually, in the theater, I audibly went, what? Was when they reveal that in the middle of the ocean, they built this giant, robotic fortress to house, I guess, metahumans. And who do they end up housing? Falcon, a regular dude. Ant-Man, a regular dude. Hawkeye, a regular dude. Oh, and Wanda too. But like, they put like the least, with the exception of Wanda, they put like the least like the normal regular dudes in this freaking like ultra max like floating prison that costs like $1 billion probably. Like, who was that for? Like, why? You could have just put them in a jail somewhere and they would have been just as secure.
Man, that is such a good point.
I'm like, that is as ridiculous. That moment right there is as ridiculous as freaking what's her face in Suicide Squad getting a bunch of criminals to go hunt down Enchantress in the middle of an abandoned city. Like, there's no difference in the insanity of those two decisions. But people just let it slide because it's a game. I'm like, I get the letting it slide a little bit. It's a summer movie, it's fun, but it makes me a little worried that if people let it slide and let it slide and let it slide, we're just going to be in a spot where the freaking Joel Schumacher Batman is okay again.
Yeah, exactly right. Yeah,
we can't have that happen again. So like, we've got to collectively sort of remind ourselves, like, yeah, it was fine, but here's the problems, and like continuously try to push them to make better and better stuff.
Right. We're smart enough. It's not. That's the thing. The action sequences, like, if you're going to the movie just for that, for the action sequence, it's going to be there.
Yeah.
And
if you want action, let's just dust off Arnold Schwarzenegger out of retirement and have him make all those Michael Bay style movies again. And let's just do that.
Right.
Yeah.
Well, that probably is, unless you have more to say about Civil War, that's probably a good way to flip it right there, because the next movie I watched was Deadpool, which you had seen in the theater. Am I correct?
I did. I'd seen it in the theater a couple weeks after it came out.
Oh wow!
It was kind of sparse. It was me and like 8 other people. So
I'd heard all the hype when it was in the theater, and I just never. I didn't think it would really appeal to me, and then I had friends say like, "Oh, you're not going to like it," which I took to mean like it's too gory and silly or something, and. But I ended up loving that. And when you talk about like action movie in the Schwarzenegger movies or whatever, the Deadpool description, at least when I, where I bought it online was, from the studio that brought you all 3 Taken movies. Like it was all kind of, tongue in cheek, kind of like, but it was exactly what like all those Taken movies and all those Schwarzenegger movies should have been. Like this was like a superhero Die Hard, and it was awesome.
That's a really good comparison. Wow.
Yeah.
That's a perfect comparison. Oh my God, you're the first person to say though. I mean, I'm sure it's been said otherwise, but I have not heard it from anyone yet.
It is,
but that's exactly what it should be.
It's possible that I got that from our sometime co-conspirator Brian, who also coined Ned's head. But that he and I,
Brian, you got to get on the show more often or get your own show.
He and I had a conversation about it where we were talking about action movies that it is like, and Die Hard came up. Like, this is just, one of the things that put me off was all the talk about the fourth wall breaking. I just thought, I don't want a really corny, like I don't want a Jim Carrey movie, And we're just hamming it up for the camera. But it really turned out to be more like Die Hard in that way of where, McClane is muttering to himself, come to the coast, have some fun. Like when he's crawling through the air ducts and stuff, like that was kind of what it sounded like to me, when Deadpool was doing that. And the jokes were awesome. Like they were, when he was making jokes on himself and the medium of film, they all worked,
Well, they all worked only because Ryan Reynolds knew exactly how to. I mean, like it was like watching Van Wilder 2 as a superhero movie, right? Like he knows exactly how to mug for the camera. Like you couldn't have cast anyone else to do that. And I'm so glad he stuck with it because he's been involved in that project for 6 or 7 years now. And he's been largely on the back of him and Tim Miller's ideas, like pushing it. Fox is like, no. So they finally gave him a shot, gave him very little money to do it. And only because like that guy he was born for that role. So it worked really well. Here's my point though, with Deadpool. And this is, again, did that come before? That was before Batman v Superman, right? Or was it right? Okay.
Yeah.
So I had seen that. Yeah, that was kind of the first one. And then I had seen Batman v Superman, I think 2 weeks later, because it was like March-ish. This took the Valentine's Day slot this year, which Kingsman occupied last year. And I hate to keep coming back to Kingsman every damn time, but had Kingsman not come out last year, I think I would have liked Deadpool more because that sort of like shocking, like, oh my God, that like violence or stuff that happens that's almost like Looney Tune-esque in its absurdity. We got that in Kingsman. So I was kind of like, well, I've seen this before. Right. And just the fact that, some of the jokes were really good. Ryan Reynolds was great. Like he carried it for me, but it's not one of those movies that I've gone back to just because like, I don't want to keep making every goddamn podcast about Kingsman, but it's like that movie was so charming and hit all those notes so perfectly. Anything that's going to get in that space like Deadpool did has got to be even better for me to really like it that much.
Well, and I'm glad you brought that up because like if I quip that it's like a Die Hard for the modern form, like you're exactly right. It was so Kingsman-ish.
Yeah.
And
not in terms of story, but in terms of tone and execution and all of that. And the fact that it was a Valentine's Day weekend movie again,
Yeah. And, okay. So who directed Kingsman? I'm sorry.
Oh, Jesus.
Was it Edgar Wright?
No. It was Kick-Ass.
Matthew Vaughn.
Matthew Vaughn. Yeah.
But regardless, that my point was going to be kind of the same, which is I think Matthew Vaughn and Edgar Wright. What the heck is his name? The Scott Pilgrim director. Pardon me while I've quickly Googled this. Just Edgar Wright. For some reason, I thought it was like Edgar Wright somethings. So he had like a third last name or something.
And anyway, I didn't even realize he directed Scott Pilgrim, so thanks for that.
So, but it, Deadpool benefited from the tone of those movies, but I do... there is a Britishness to the Matthew Vaughn and Edgar Wright movies that is, whereas Deadpool is like, felt to me tonally like definitely American.
in Canada.
Because I definitely prefer it to Kingsman. I mean, I know you're a huge Kingsman fan, and
okay, good.
I really enjoyed Kingsman, but I sort of saw it the other way of like Deadpool was like what I wanted Kingsman and a couple of those other movies and however we want to tie that genre together suffer a little bit from the like Tarantino like gore porn problem.
Okay.
And that's what I thought Deadpool was going to be. I just thought like, oh my God, it's going to be like Dead Alive or something where everybody.
There's some gore in Deadpool too, though.
Oh, there's a lot of gore, but it's not. I was thinking of like the old horror movies like Dead Alive or something where there's a dude with a lawnmower that's like just mowing down something. And which happens in Kingsman a little bit, but Deadpool to me, I don't know. It just worked a little bit better. So, I wouldn't. I'm not going to fight it rather than like Kingsman more.
Well, and again, I don't want to make this all about Kingsman, but I think as you were talking, the thing about Kingsman that works so well is that it takes this sort of very charming, sophisticated sort of fabric and just pokes all these holes in it, right? Or takes like, this like what would otherwise be a freaking Jane Austen story or just a typical like, Downton Abbey story and takes like a lighter, just like burns holes through it. And you're like, Jesus. Whereas with Deadpool, the character of Wade and like the world is all grungy and sort of lower, it's lower class and just it feels filthier to begin with. So when you add in these like extreme kinds of things, it doesn't modulate as much as Kingsman does. And I think that's where I was kind of like, oh, okay, like it tonally felt a little bit more even, which I know is usually good, but in this case, it's like, well.
Yeah, I wouldn't argue with that. I think you're right. It didn't. I don't think it modulated too much. In fact, one of the things that kind of shocked me about Deadpool, I don't know if I can tie this in very well, but I didn't expect there to be such a deep background story, origin story kind of thing, especially with like the love interest thing.
Oh yeah,
and it stayed in the tone, but it was almost like when they came out of that story and he is Deadpool and he's much wackier than he, was, in the past. That to me felt like a sort of modulated, like that modulation was right there, but it was so brief. And I almost felt like, gosh, I wish he'd been like even quippier in the flashbacks. Or it was just funny because that was sort of a thing where I was like, "Ooh, the tone kind of slipped for me right there." But it was such that to me is like nitpicky because it didn't take me out of the movie at all. I was just kind of shocked that there was like an emotional backstory, I guess, to Deadpool that they put in there. So I probably would have enjoyed it if they hadn't had that and had done. Almost like a Joker and Dark Knight thing where maybe he gave you a couple of different backstories and you're like, which one is real?
That would have been awesome. He keeps cutting to a new one. He's like, but that's bullshit. Like almost like Clue. Right. It's like, this could have happened, but maybe it's this. And
man, if they had done Deadpool like Clue, that would have been hilarious.
See, that's that extra gear that I wanted where it's like, oh my God. Like I think it, and I'm sure most of it is budget constraints and just the fact that Tim Miller hasn't directed a movie before. Tim Miller's directed a lot of great video game stuff. Don't get me wrong, but this is the first like full featured movie he's done because he's later in his career. He's built up to it. He's totally earned it. Don't get me wrong, but it's like I think had he been a little bit more seasoned, we would have gotten that extra gear. Like okay, let's pepper in some extra stuff.
Well, it was almost like it was almost like to me, it was like they were pushing it so much with just a superhero cursing and having gore and stuff like that, and making fun of the X-Men that that they sort of didn't want to push it in some other ways where we might have liked them to like it if that backstory had been crazier or more confusing or something. It might have been okay for like a weird Suicide Squad kind of like that's actually one of the reasons I'm so glad you brought up Suicide Squad in relation to Civil War because we can talk about it without having to talk about the movie. But I was actually okay with sort of the introduction of the characters in Suicide Squad, how the title cards kind of came up and explained who they were.
Yeah, I was
because I felt like, yeah, let's skip all this. Like we don't need, and then the way they is Will Smith Deadshot? Is that his character's name?
Yeah.
Like the way they sort of tied in his emotional backstory was great. Like that was fine. That's all we needed. I didn't need a 20-minute diversion into this like whole story about everything, you know?
I really wonder though, remember that this shtick on Suicide Squad is they had a cut and then the studio brought in the group that edited the trailer and made them do a cut. And the movie we saw was a merged version of those two cuts. I wonder if that sort of quick pace, like cut to the chase kind of stuff was in the original.
Well, there's an extended version of it for rent and sale right now. And Film School Rejects has a hilarious review of like how useless it is. You know, like nobody needed an extended cut of this movie.
I'm sure not. I mean, nobody needed that. I mean, pound for pound, it against Batman v Superman, I liked it better because it kind of seemed to. Whoa. They kind of, I know, right? But as odd as this is to say as a good thing, I think they took a lot of the Batman v Superman criticism very seriously, and that's why they brought in that other group to do another edit. Like, we got to tighten this thing up a little bit more. Here's my other question. Go back to Deadpool, though. What did you think about the way they handled the X-Men? Did it seem off-putting that there was only two of them that you ever saw? Like, they explained it. It was hilarious how they explained it, but it's like, was it? And did the two they choose work for you?
So. And I don't know, I'll just preface it with, I don't know in the comics, like if there's a existing relationship between Colossus and Deadpool or what's her name? Teenage Warhead.
Negasonic Teenage
Negasonic.
A Grant Morrison creation, by the way.
But I just thought they were awesome foils for him. Like their personalities were so like Colossus being portrayed in that way.
The Boy Scout,
but almost so accurate to how I remember when I first started reading X-Men. Like that's how he was. He was
always be prepared.
Yeah, and they always like wrote him with these funny, like tropey Russian accent kind of things that he would say, and he was very much like this big brother to his younger sister Ilyana, and so that's how I remember him. Like in the '90s, like that was how he was written, and. Negasonic, I have no comic book relationship to, but she was just perfect in the movie. I mean, obviously, like just, like such an awesome thing to have like a teenager making fun of Deadpool as like an old guy.
And she couldn't be less interested in him. She's just texting the whole time, just like, okay, whatever, he can heal. Cool.
Yeah. Oh, and I almost forgot my favorite part of it was that, one of my favorite parts was that Gina Carano is the bad guy's right-hand woman that does all his ass kicking for him.
Who's that?
So she is, I guess, an MMA fighter, but she was in Steven Soderbergh's Haywire, which is a movie that I find very. That's awkward. I awkwardly defend it. Like I really like it, but So I just I liked her as a foil for Negasonic. Like when they're in that battle, when there's there's a whole battle at the end where Colossus and Negasonic are fighting whatever her name is, and
what is her name? It's my favorite moment there too is when her boob kind of falls out and he's like, "Oh, I'm so sorry. You cover up," and she takes that as an advantage.
And it was so like cool in a movie that's already like vulgar and full of violence and stuff that they didn't go the extra step and like show it and make it like, okay, now it's really about looking at this woman's breast,
Exactly. It's that kind of confidence that I kept bouncing back and forth between, I wish they'd take it into another gear, but oh man, you can tell there was moments like that where they're like, we know what we're doing. Like just hang back. We're fine. That's right.
Yeah.
She was cool. She was great too. Like she kind of in that tradition of hiring like wrestlers or fighters and stuff to play, you have what's his face in Guardians of the Galaxy who does, he doesn't have to act a lot. He just has to say words I don't think she says a single word really. And it's all face acting that works really well. Like she carries the presence incredibly well.
Yeah, exactly. So I mean that's probably all the notes I got on Deadpool.
Well, let's jump from the X-Men of Deadpool to the real X-Men, because and this is the one I'm glad we're ending on this one, because X-Men Apocalypse, of all the movies this summer, was the one that I actually was like, oh, this is more what I was hoping for, right? This is kind of a return to form. It wasn't my absolute favorite X-Men movie, but it wasn't, I mean, a lot of people kind of shit on it, and I don't know why.
Yeah.
I thought, it did everything it needed to do. Yeah, Oscar Isaac could have tried harder or been directed harder, like considering how good he is. Yeah, they could have done a little bit more, but at that point, to a comment made earlier, you're going to have to split it into two movies. Like, there's only so much you can do in the context of 2 hours, right? And it's like, right. I think all the things I wanted to see would have been better for an X-Men TV show. So it's like, for what it was, I mean, the fact that it's Bryan Singer, who he's polarizing, because a lot of people love what he did with the genre. He made it serious. He made it, you can lay a lot of what we're seeing now in terms of comic movies on his original X-Men 1 and 2. Like, they sort of paved the way, along with Blade and a couple of those early 2000s movies. So the fact that he's back, and I love tonally what he does with the X-Men. Like, everything he does works for me. And then you throw John Ottman's score in there, and and John Ottman usually edits the movies too. So he's one of those weird cats who does the music and the editing at the same time for these Singer movies. Like, I think he did that for Valkyrie too, if I'm not mistaken. Correct me if I'm wrong on that one, or double check me. But
yeah,
when that John Ottman, that dun 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 dun, like when that kicks in, it's like, and that was like when that didn't happen in the third X-Men movie, and when it didn't happen in First Class, even though I freaking love First Class too. Like, when that music kicks in, you're like, oh, this is X-Men. This is the X-Men movies that I love right here. So that was, that opening sequence was really hooked me in, and I was in it till the end.
Well, I was the same way. And you had even told me over the summer that you enjoyed it. And I think I was like, like coming out of Civil War and Superman versus Batman, I just didn't give it a shot.
Yeah. Yeah.
And it was one of those, same thing as Civil War, where I was like, well, I got some time to kill. Let me just check this out on digital video. And well, the other thing that also turns me off was, we already knew it was going to be about this giant cataclysmic event. And not only am I tired of that in superhero movies in general, but the X-Men especially, because it's been like, except for X-Men 1.
Yeah, you're right.
And maybe First Class, you could argue.
No. You can argue. Well, no, I guess you're right. I was going to say you could argue 2, but 2's, they were trying to kill everybody in the world. So yeah, 2 was more.
Yeah. 2 and 3 and First Class, it seemed like they were only about to kill the 12 or so X-Men and Hellfire Club members on that island.
But they were going to kick off freaking World War II if they didn't stop it.
Right.
So it's like, which was
a kind of cool way to weave in the history and give it kind of an alt history to it. But anyway, so knowing that it was Apocalypse, I was wary, but I instantly loved the interplay between, the young characters. And I mean, it was just like you said, like, I just strapped in immediately and was like, oh, I'm in. This is awesome.
Yeah, it was. And I went into it too going, man, I've been disappointed. Not massively, but like Batman v Superman was meh. Civil War was meh. Yeah. And so I was just kind of like, oh, come on, please just give me something. And the fact that right away, and it was hokey, and it was, kind of cheesy and stuff, but it's like that, I needed that after the sort of, dearth of February through April, right? It's like, I just needed something a little bit more. And then, I mean, let's spoiler a few things. Like, definitely. The fact that they that Singer kind of brought back the Phoenix thing again at the very end, even though it had nothing to do with the story other than just a cool moment. I am one of those people who go to the mat every time saying, had Singer had stayed on X-Men and not foolishly run off to Superman and finished that third one and like helped write it and helped direct it, that third one could have been unbelievable, because he set up, oh my God. See, I still am, but for the longest time, that X-Men 2 was my favorite movie, bar none, of any movie ever. Because what they did, not only was it like the pacing was perfect, the character moments were perfect, but he does this thing where he takes a singular 5-second moment in X-Men 1, where at the end of the battle, Jean Grey, they're all teaming up. They're like, we're all going to use our powers to stop Magneto. Cyclops, you hold him, Jean, you hold him in place. Storm, you wave him over that way. Cyclops, you do this. And when all that's done, they finish it. There's this 5 seconds. It's all it is. It's like maybe even 3 seconds where Jean, she's got like this reaction, like something's wrong. And they don't ever talk about it again through the rest of the movie. Like that's towards the end. And then they start X-Men 2 and they're like, oh no, that's still happening. And it's going to build and it's going to build. And so you get to the end of X-Men 2 and you're like, oh my God, he threaded this moment perfectly through. And now he's set up this amazing thing that Brett Ratner freaking just took a dump on in the third one. And
we should do X-Men 3 in a how did this get made style.
Because it would be too been,
that's one of those movies where I watched it in the theater and it was kind of like watching Phantom Menace in a way where I walked out and was like, I really want to say I liked it, but I knew I was like, no, it was terrible.
I sat in the theater. I was there opening night at midnight. I was so excited, even though I know there was a different director and stuff. I'm like, oh my God, there's no way they can ruin this. He gave them the perfect gift. And it was like the last episode of Lost. Like every 10 minutes, my heart just sank a little bit more and a little bit more and a little bit more to where at the very end, when Wolverine's like, Jane, I'm just like, just kill everybody. Just you kill him, you kill her. And let's just end this, put them out of their misery. Cause I just don't know where you take. So the fact that Bryan Singer could come in Days of Future Past, which I also loved. Like Bryan Singer can come and take Days of Future Past and basically say, yeah, that movie didn't really happen. And that shitty Wolverine movie, that didn't happen either. And we're just going to pretend those movies didn't happen. 1 and 2 did, but those movies did not. And basically erase them from the continuity was A, magic trick, and B, just like, I love Days of Future Past. So I would say Days of Future Past is better than Apocalypse by far, but Apocalypse was still really fun, right? Like it was, and it's sad that Singer isn't going to be doing anymore, or so he says. So I'm just like, well, and I love Matthew Vaughn in First Class, so he can come back anytime.
And I'm not I think I would probably put Days of Future Past and Apocalypse. I think I would say I like Days of Future Past better, but but they feel tonally the same to me. Like,
they do, yeah.
Because I'm not a huge Cyclops fan, but all the young Scott Summers and Alex Summers stuff in Apocalypse, I was into it.
It was fun. Yeah.
And of course, and then the one thing I wanted to bring up, the character that we all obviously love is Quicksilver.
Yeah.
And the way that Apocalypse brought in who we can only assume is the Scarlet Witch, because Magneto is the father of Quicksilver and Scarlet Witch. And, when they are attempting to arrest him in Russia, because he's used his powers and they are afraid that it is actually Magneto. And the little girl has this his daughter has this crazy reaction, and these birds start attacking the men. It's very witchcrafty. And, it's like, oh, that's a Scarlet Witch. And then to have what happen, which is that the policemen accidentally kill her. It was just so like, oh my God. Like, it was in that moment where you're like, yeah, of course Magneto just wants to scorch the earth. This is,
I never put 2 and 2 together, but you're right. Cause they've shown Quicksilver in, First Class and was he in First Class?
No, he's not in First Class. He's only in Days of Future Past. That's actually why I hesitated to say that I liked it better. And then I realized it was his origin story in that first, or not origin story, but that first scene that we all freaked out about, where he's in slow motion in the
But if you, and then the thing and the time in a bottle.
And that like sort of circle. Yeah. The time in the bottle. That's exactly what I was trying to
But they show him in that movie, like clinching his like sister while Magneto's like, addressing the world on TV. So he has a sister there, but it's never like, it's just such a throwaway moment. So like the fact that this other girl could be his half sister I like that way more. I'm going to have to go back and rewatch this now with that in mind. Cause that's a cool twist.
I wonder if there was if there actually had to be a legal agreement, or if Fox and Marvel Studios just sort of like if the writer directors, like, you know, if Feige watched Days of Future Past and went, for shit's sake, we're never going to do Quicksilver better than that. We're just going to kill him off in Ultron. And likewise, if Fox watched Ultron and went, damn it, that was a good Scarlet Witch.
Yeah.
We give in. We'll kill her off in Apocalypse.
You know what else is interesting? So going back to Deadpool real quick, there was a trade where Marvel owned Negasonic because of the way it was created by Grant Morrison.
Oh.
Fox owned Mogo the Living Planet. So when James Gunn started doing Guardians, he has come out and has said Mogo was always going to be Star-Lord's father, and he always was going to cast Kurt Russell as that role. So when he found out they didn't have the rights to it, he's like, well, you guys kind of need to get that. So Marvel's like, hey, so we want Mogo. And they're like, well, cool, because we want Negasonic. And so they just did a trade. So that's why those two characters ended up where they did.
All that back and forth between the studios with the Marvel universe. And this is, when we proposed the topic for tonight's show, I think I'd brought up like, oh, I just binged all these movies, and you were the one who proposed like, let's just tie this into the MCU, like in general. And I'm like fascinated by the Sony Fox Marvel standoffs and truces, and you know, I mean, because Civil War, we finally got a Spider-Man that, you know, like kick some ass, and that everyone seems to be you know, into. We certainly have an Aunt Bay that I'm into. And I you know, I just but I love hearing, like, you know, stories of that. Did we ever talk? I mean, not that we want to get into this, but along the studio lines is that I did watch that new Fantastic Four movie eventually.
Oh, Jesus, why?
It is god awful. Like, it's the only superhero movie I can recall that has gotten worse once they get their superpowers.
It's the first movie besides Kingdom of Heaven where I just had to turn it off, and like I couldn't. Really? And I came back and I tried again. So I didn't even make it all the way through. I'm just like, I can't do this. It's
yeah, I don't know that I couldn't claim that I made it all the way through. I think I let it play through, but I think at some point I just got up and did something else.
You know what's really obnoxious about that movie? So tying that back to X-Men, one of the co-writers on the screenplay, Simon frickin' Kinberg. Now, if you're not aware, Simon Kinberg has written, let me just go through the list, X-Men Apocalypse, X-Men Days of Future Past, the Sherlock Holmes movie with Robert Downey Jr., Mr. and Mrs. Smith. Oh, he did co-write X-Men The Last Stand, so there's that. So maybe, he wrote a lot of the Star Wars Rebels episodes. So wait, okay, I take it back. He is kind of hit and miss.
Oh, okay. Yeah, I mean, nothing about it added up to being a good movie. That's what, but I guess what primarily interests me is, as we have discussed on the show before, I think the dumbest superpower is stretching.
Yeah.
And being really fast used to be a second place to that. Although the TV show Flash and the Quicksilver stuff in X-Men has changed my mind on that. Like that.
Well, I think, and just by the looks of it, the way they're going to do Flash in the movies looks pretty cool too.
Oh my God, man.
Barry Allen's going to save that goddamn franchise. He and Wonder Woman are going to be the marquee characters moving forward. I guarantee.
This is one of the incredibly frustrating things about the theatrical print of Superman versus Batman. There is a Flash moment in the extended cut. You got it. I don't want to spoil it. I don't want to tell you what happens.
Beyond just him on a surveillance video?
Fucking blew me away. And it's like, and you're just like screaming at your screen, like, why did you cut this out?
Oh, Jesus.
Of all the things you could have cut out, we needed less Lex.
Oh, you know? God. Don't even remind me. For a moment, there was a crystal clear moment just now where I was thinking, yeah, I want to rewatch that, until you said Lex. I'm like, oh, I got to put up with all that.
I knew it.
Because in my mind,
he is definitely not redeemed in the extended cut. It's not like a cut exists where you're like, oh, I get where they were going with that asinine character.
In the universe of my mind, Oscar Isaac is Lex Luthor and all is right with the world. Like that, you know. What did you think of Oscar Isaac as Apocalypse, by the way, going back to X-Men?
There was probably a whole hour of the movie where I was like, why did you even, pay this guy? Like, it could have been anyone. Like,
could have been Clancy Brown. I mean, that was my.
He had like no lines, for half the movie. They were all delivered in this way where it's like, you know, like anyone could have done it.
Yeah.
And then, but then with the struggle between him and Professor X, I can't say that it needed Oscar Isaac, but I got it. Like I was like, oh, this is a good villain at this point.
He brought some gravity. I mean, he wasn't terrible. I'm like, you.
And I really liked the whole weird origin story of like, maybe this is how a god is made.
Yeah.
Like this is a crazy reference, but in Groundhog Day,
continue.
Bill Murray's character tells Andy McDowell's character, he's like, I am a god.
Oh,
and
good
she's
call.
like, what? Like, what is wrong with you? And he narrates a series of events that are about to happen. He's like, this guy's going to drop a tray of glasses. That guy's going to say, nice job, whatever. And he tells her all about herself and stuff. And she's like, she's questioning him. And he says, look, maybe that's the way the real God is. Maybe he doesn't have superpowers. Maybe he was just been around long enough that he knows everything.
Wow. You just changed my game on Groundhog Day too, because you're right. That's
Groundhog Day is like the most philosophical movie I've ever seen. I've watched that hundreds of times. And on one Groundhog Day at Blockbuster, I just put it on repeat for my entire 8-hour shift. And I was the manager, and none of my employees could do shit about it.
Oh, that's great. That's perfect though. Like I would, if I walked into a Blockbuster and that was like, that would be,
wouldn't you just stay there for like an hour?
Oh yeah, and then I would walk up to you and go, "Do you just keep this on repeat all day?" You'd be like, "No, we do." Like, oh my god,
yeah, I did.
Let me rent even more from you. The only problem I had with Apocalypse that was a lingering problem was just this idea that, and I get it. I get Jennifer Lawrence is a massive actress now, and you want to sell a movie off of her performance, but Mystique isn't that interesting in this movie at all. Like we didn't need her to be like, she didn't need to be the sort of fulcrum character. She didn't need to be like nothing. Like she could have been removed entirely and that movie still would have functioned basically the same way. Like,
I think technically you're right, but I would argue like that that she really was the fulcrum. I loved that like one of the great moments of it is when Hank tells her when she's surrounded by the kids at the school, he's like, they look up to you. And like that, I was like, oh, like it was like I got chills kind of moment of like, oh, the importance of Mystique to the X-Men legacy, like the story that these kids have been told is, that was really powerful to me. And so just for that, I thought it worked, but I agree with you. Like technically she's not a powerful character, but there was another moment where she, right when she was like, flipping into her blue skin, where I was like just momentarily so impressed with the connection between all these movies that Singer's done to the Rebecca Romijn Mystique, where it's like, oh man, you just, there have been moments like that in Days of Future Past and in Apocalypse and even in First Class too, where Jennifer Lawrence's character, you see that there was an alternate history that turns her into the Rebecca Romijn character.
Okay, thank you for that, because I'm so glad you brought this up. When Days of Future Past happened, the biggest critique people had was, I thought Mystique was a bad guy. I'm like, and then everybody was like, how did knowing that Days of Future Past was coming there? I'm like, forget all that. Like we have 2-3 more movies where we get to see her arc into becoming more evil. Like how heartbreaking would it be to know by the time, and this is before we knew that they were going to, destroy the continuity and get rid of X-Men 3, all these things. I'm like, how awesome would it be to know, to see her descent and then go back and rewatch X-Men 1 and 2 and watch her like sabotage Charles' machine. Like I want to see that. Like that's going to hold a whole new meaning if we can see how she got there. And I think, I'm not saying she had to go full bad, and I get Days of Future Past her to change the course of events, but I would have liked to have seen her a little bit more desperado at the end instead of like, I'm the new leader of the X-Men. I'm like, well, okay, I guess, but it's just like, I wanted to see her go rogue again. Like she did at the end of Days of Future Past, right? It wasn't like she's like, Charles, you're my best friend again. She's like, I'm going. I'll be back. The other big thing, and I didn't remember this until just now, is the continuity between Days of Future Past and Apocalypse. there's a big missing holes, and the biggest one of all is Wolverine. So we see him at the end of Days of Future Past. He is captured. He's pulled out of the ocean, of the lake or wherever they are in DC. He's put on a boat. You think by William Stryker, who's really Mystique. So Mystique pulled him out. Yet somehow in Apocalypse, he's truly captured by Stryker and turned into the Weapon X mutant that we all know.
Okay, so am I misremembering this? I don't remember the reveal that Mystique was Stryker in that moment on the boat.
Her eyes do the Mystique yellow swishy thing. So I'm like, don't do that if you're not going to pay it off like later on, or just make it like even a comment, going back to your original point about just like give us a little context. Like if she had made a comment like, I had him and Stryker took him, like at some point, like something, just give me a line that sort of suggests why this is the case.
I'll use the phrase that our earlier credited friend Brian hates when I use, which is Wolverine was such a deus ex machina in Apocalypse. Like it was like there are these kids that are trapped, and they're like, somehow, how are these kids going to get out without like and escape like 200 soldiers? What if all they do is release Wolverine, and he does all the dirty work for them? But I agree with you. That was kind of a loose end. I forgot that Mystique was revealed as Stryker in Days of Future Past.
Just something. Even if she were to go off with Magneto, like just something to suggest that the events of movies 1 and 2 could still happen if we believed hard enough. Just something where she's not just. And it would have been even more heartbreaking to like, these kids love you, and she's like, I can't stay. I just can't deal with that pressure. That sort of. I can't square that in my head. Like just something where I want a little bit more heartbreak. It seemed like the ending was a little too clean for me.
Honestly, I was shocked that they all lived.
Yeah.
Because that was kind of on my mind, was like, well, I mean, there's got to be some sacrifice here, besides just Professor X being bald.
Is Angel?
I guess we're led to believe he did. Like Storm joined him. Olivia Munn, whoever her character is named. Yeah, she escaped, right? Or did she also crash to Earth and die?
No, she's like, I'll be back. She does one of those like I'll be back sort of turns to the camera. I'm like, all right. No,
and Angel, I guess we're led to believe, dies or something. But I guess he not in such a definitive way that he can't be resurrected believably.
Sure.
So before we sign off, I'll mention, I think we've mentioned on earlier podcasts, but if you have not seen the Rogue cut of Days of Future Past, I highly recommend it.
I have not yet. I need to go do that.
Gotta watch it. If you enjoyed Days of Future Past, it just adds basically they shot the whole movie with Rogue in it. Mm-hmm. And then I guess for time's sake, this is ingenious on its own, they just removed all the instances of Rogue. Like there's one moment where she has to take over for Kitty Pryde, because remember, Kitty gets hurt in this one attack.
Oh, yeah.
That like breaches that room that they're in, like controlling Logan's mind. Mm-hmm. And Rogue has to absorb her power, and they have to pull her off of Wolverine, and Rogue has to sit there and have her hands on either side of his head. And it's like just the digital alteration they did just in this very, very brief moment, so that it's not Rogue's hands, but it's Kitty Pryde's, just to make the theatrical version work. It's like, that's every part. I mean, it's like so interesting because of how they just fully wiped her appearance out of the movie. And she was actually in tons of scenes. And
where can I find that cut? Is that on the DVD or the Blu-ray?
That I don't know about, because I saw it when it was on HBO for a brief moment. Oh. HBO did this weird thing in the HBO Now app last year where like 1 month they had the original cut, the next month they had a Rogue cut, and then it went back to the original cut, and the Rogue cut never resurfaced. But it's also on like Google Play, and I'm sure on iTunes and stuff. So it's just fascinating, and like I was saying, I love Anna Paquin's version of Rogue, and so seeing that movie recut with her in it was awesome.
Nice. Well, on that note, where can folks find you, sir?
I am on Twitter at HeyToddA. Where can people find you, Taylor?
I'm on Twitter at at I was like, I'd hate to.
I feel like every time we go to the credits, one of us throws the other one off.
I'm on Twitter at Taylor Trask, and the both of us are on their.network.
Type that into a browser.
As well as wherever podcasts are distributed, iTunes, Pocket Cast, Stitcher, Google Play, any of them. Go find it.
Yeah, and this is the Todd and Taylor Show. We also have another show that is kind of like How Did This Get Made? In the sense that there are two dudes and a lady discussing movies, and in no other way is it like How Did This Get Made? But it is called Missing the 80s, and that is when Taylor and our friend Fia tell me about seminal, they claim, movies from the 80s that I did not see. And we have done Willow and what's the second one we did? Never Ending Story. I almost mentioned the one we're about to do. So me too. We did Willow and Never Ending Story, which everyone is shocked that I have not seen. And we are doing Flight of the Navigator on our third episode. So you should definitely find Missing the 80s, which is on their.network. It's also on iTunes and Google Play and all that stuff. Missing the 80s.
I'm wondering if we should change it to Two Dudes and a Lady Discuss Movies, because that's kind of a fun title too. That could be the tagline. Just Two Dudes and a Lady Discuss Movies. Although the conceit is that Todd hasn't seen any of these. So it's like Fia and I explain them to you.
Yeah, I have missed the 80s.
That's right.
Despite being older than both of you and having grown up in that decade.
Well, that's a whole other show too. It's like, okay.
We shockingly, like, no matter how young our friend is that we mention one of these movies to, they're always blown away that I haven't seen them. Like,
it is shocking.
Yeah, there's people that are like 23 that they're like so steeped in geek culture that of course they've seen Willow and Never Ending Story, and it's like, I can't believe you, Todd, who was a walking around child when those movies came out, did not see them.
Yeah, it is strange to say the least. Well, it's been fun. We'll see you guys next time.
Yeah, later.